Hello friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we want to talk about what's coming up tomorrow, which is the full moon, which is at 7 p.m. on the East Coast, 7:35 p.m. on the West Coast, on the West Coast, not the East Coast. And it will be, of course, 3 hours later on the East Coast. It'll be early morning the next day in Europe. And we do want to talk about this full moon, especially in the context of the situation that we're all living through right now, which is a difficult one. No matter where you are in the world, it's a difficult situation. We've learned that sheltering in place, the stay home directive, that is all over the world now, on almost every state in the United States as well. Some states are doing it individually rather than by state order, but everybody's really doing it. That is necessary to slow the spread of this virus. And so one thing as a public service, we do want to make this announcement, echoing the announcement of health officials in this country and everywhere else, that by social distancing and by avoiding the possibility of contact or by the infection spreading by social distancing, we're really saving lives. We're saving the hospitals getting overwhelmed. We're flattening the curve, which means that it won't peak to the extent that the hospitals are overrun. I mean, that's what's been happening. It happened in New York as well. It's a bad situation over there. So with no further ado, let's take a look at this full moon. And as you know, the full moon is when they wind up at opposite degrees in the zodiac, the sun and the moon, and that will happen just at sunset tomorrow here on the West Coast. And you can tell, actually, you should be able to see the chart now. You can tell about the sunset because we have this symbol right here, which is the ascendant. This implies the ascendant rather than putting AS, which some of this software does. We just put a circle with a flat line across it because this is the ascendant of the chart right here, the ascendant and descendant axis of the chart. And that is symbolized in this we're putting Aries on the cusp and then Taurus. This is the natural chart. But here's where the ascendant actually lines up. So the moon will be rising just at the moment of the full. And that makes sense because 7:35 p.m. is just around sunset, almost exactly sunset. So we will see, just as the sun goes down, the moon coming up is kind of dramatic in that way. And the other thing to think about is, being in cardinal signs as they are, the sun and moon opposite each other around the middle of Aries and Libra, cardinal signs, they make a square to the midpoint of Capricorn, which is very close to where Jupiter and Pluto are still in close conjunction. You could see that Pluto is actually only 5 minutes of a degree away from the 25-degree mark, where then Jupiter occupies. They're about half a degree, half of a full degree, less than that really, apart from each other. So, and then also, what do we see as well? We see that Mars, having transited into conjunction with Saturn in the 1 degree mark, the 2nd degree of Aquarius, has moved a little beyond that, but they're still quite close together. And again, looking at just the major degrees, it would be around 3 degrees at the midpoint. We see that Venus is at 3 degrees. So this is very tight to the midpoint of Mars and Saturn. Venus is quite tight, and it forms actually a grand trine with another point in Libra, which is Maki, which is one of these new planets beyond Pluto that have been named by the IAU. No plans to name other ones, so I think these are significant planets. Maki, right here, looks like a little Birdman, which astrologer Philip Sedgwick suggested actually as a variation on the Pluto glyph that looks a little bit like a Birdman. Another variation on the Pluto glyph. This is Haumea. And Haumea is intended to look a little bit like a pregnant lady because she was always giving birth. It's the creation goddess. Oh, okay, sorry about that. It looks like we weren't showing the chart there. My apologies for that. I forgot to push a button. So all this time you've been seeing me talk and not seeing what I was pointing to. So what I was pointing to is the fact that this little symbol here with the circle and the straight line across is actually right by the moon, the same degree, almost the same minute as the moon. So the moon will be rising. That's the rising point of the chart, the actual rising point. And this is the natural chart from Aries onward. So we're arranging it that way so we can see everything laid out against the signs in the normal order of the signs. No matter where you are, this will be true. But this point will vary. The actual sunset is at 7:35, and that's indicated by the fact that the sun is opposite this point. And so dramatically the moon will be rising as the sun sets, and they're both square to this Jupiter-Pluto, very close together, Pluto being 24:55, 5 minutes away from being the 25-degree point, so these are quite close together in the sky, and they are also going to be in a square alignment with about 6 degrees to the sun and moon, and they're also going to be sextile, which I haven't mentioned before, by Mercury. Mercury is at the 25-degree mark of Pisces, exactly partile to the same degree, sextile to Jupiter. The Jupiter-Pluto conjunction is very close. These are difficult times. These are transformational times. We might recognize that, and I've talked about this, that astrologers for months now, or actually for years now, have been talking about the Pluto-Saturn conjunction coming at the beginning of the year as being an indication, and also at the end of the year in November, when it will be a triple conjunction with Saturn, which is coming back. Pluto and Jupiter will be all together after they retrograde, and then they come together again in November. So the timing of January and November is very important about this transformational episode that we're in. And astrologers, as I say, for many years have been talking about what a tremendous social transformation would take place in 2020, and we're witnessing that. We're witnessing the social distancing and this dive that the economy is taking is going to leave its mark, and we will have a completely different society when we emerge from this, which we will, because science will prevail. You know, the scientists, the epidemiologists are working to try to identify how this virus can be treated so that there will be a treatment for it, a drug ultimately, just like there was for HIV. There will be also a vaccine in all probability. And they're hoping to get the vaccine ready before the end of the year. They've said in the past that it might take as long as a year and a half, which means that the vaccine would not be ready in time for the expected comeback in the fall, because this virus is sensitive to heat. In all likelihood, we don't know the full extent of that, but we think that the summer months are going to be easier. People think that. They've been talking about that. So coming back roaring in the fall is very likely, considering that November is going to be a big time for Saturn and Pluto. So that's the same message I've been giving. I want to reiterate, because it is so important for us to be aware of that, and to be aware also of this, and also to be aware of the spiritual implications of this event. That it lines up with astrological happenings in the sky. What might we learn from that? That there is an evolutionary process going on within each of us, individually and also for the society itself. And our individual evolution contributes to that of the society, does it not? We are, as in a hologram, each one of us is a part of the whole. Each one of us symbolically represents the whole. And the actions of each one of us, especially right now with this virus, are vitally important. So that we can, as a group, as a social unit, we can stop the spread or slow the spread of this virus until more testing can eventually see the exact outlines of where it is, and we can find out how to get people isolated, keep people from getting mass exposed and more and more infections and more hospitalizations, and therefore get a handle on it, get what they call ahead of the virus, instead of chasing it as we are now from behind the curve. So flattening the curve is all important, as many people have been talking about on the news. And it's individual actions. It's individuals contributing to their understanding, by their understanding, contributing to what is going on, by their recognition of the need for socially distancing themselves, recognizing what they can do to really make this thing work for everybody, because that's what's required. And to that end, it's very interesting, I find it extremely interesting, that Eris, which stands for individual coming together as individuals, individual action, it's a feminine warrior energy or a spiritual warrior for finding out what is the deepest value you have within you and acting only upon that value. And you find mavericks, so to speak, that have a very strong Eris, and they have been paradigm shifters, feminist leaders, people that saw what they felt was needed for the society or for the scientific paradigm, and acted upon their own understanding and maybe shifted the entire course of history. And you see that happening right now in the person of a woman named Greta Thunberg, who has, as a 15, 16-year-old, gone up and made huge strides to really articulate her generation's plea that they be left in 40 years a world that they can live with, a world that they can actually inhabit without the rising seas and all the other environmental degradations that are very possible, that the science has been predicting, and more about that later. Another thing that I started to mention before I realized that I wasn't showing you the chart is that there is a grand trine embedded in this chart. The midpoint of the Saturn and Mars is actually closely trine to where Venus is in the sky right now at 3 degrees of Gemini. And they are both closely trine at 5 degrees of Libra to Maki, which is one of these new planets beyond Pluto. It looks a little bit like a birdman. It's a variation of the Pluto glyph. This variation of the Pluto glyph represents Haumea, which is the creation goddess of Hawaii. So these two planets are very important new planets in terms of our understanding of Earth issues as a factor, because they both represent a profound connection to nature. And they are named after indigenous gods and goddesses. I mean, Haumea is practically a perfect exemplar of nature in its fecundity. Mythologically, she was always giving birth. She was waving a magic wand that could make food appear, which of course it does in the Hawaiian Islands. And, just a great representation of nature as a power, as a potency, as something that we're all connected to, deeply connected to, especially through our unconscious process, which is much more akin to nature and speaks of the mythology of ancient times that has come down to us and is worldwide in different forms and variations that Joseph Campbell articulated to the max. He was the expert in all these world myths and talked about how myth connects us back to nature. And in nature's law and natural law and the ability for us to see how nature works and to align ourselves with that, we find a great comfort and a great understanding of just a different way to be in the world, not against nature, but with nature, supported by nature and supporting nature in turn. And guess what? Joseph Campbell had a very strong presence of Haumea, one of the earliest people I researched. Also Prince, and you can see in that, I think, the fecundity of that. He's such a charismatic person, always changing, always bringing new ideas in. Beautiful music, incredibly talented musician, as you know. Another one, by the way, is David Bowie. So you can see that this is a very powerful factor in charts we're just beginning to learn about. And I do have an article that's coming out, that's already out on the newsstands now in the Mountain Astrologer. The April edition of the Mountain Astrologer magazine has my article on the meaning of these three planets, including Eris, which I've talked about and written about extensively. There's a book out called The 10th Planet about Eris, which has been very well received. And now I'm trying to tackle a little bit the meaning of these other new ones to try to understand what this factor is in Western astrology with these newly named planets that are called dwarf planets beyond Pluto in the Kuiper Belt. So that is kind of more the esoteric punchline, but I do want to get back to just what's in the regular chart, and with normal planets, not counting these new ones. And it is very significant because we have a very powerful connection between Mars and Uranus, a square connection, and that gives inspiration, it gives impulsivity, it gives a contrast to the conservative holding back, which is saying we need to move forward in new directions. And that's very much part of this full moon. So I think we're seeing a turning point here this particular week, beginning with Tuesday night, tomorrow night. I think we're seeing that it is time to finally recognize what we're up to as a culture, as a society, get on the same page. We have to socially distance. We have to flatten the curve. We have to do the necessary supply chain to keep the hospitals functioning, which is problematic at the moment. and we have to do more testing. So I think we're all beginning to get the picture, get the point. I think everybody's beginning to come together. We're going to see more testing. We're going to see people acting in ways that individually contribute to each other and to the group effort to try to slow things down. And I think it's kind of a turning point. Not a turning point in the sense that deaths are going to start to decrease, but perhaps the rate of death is going to start to decrease, and we'll begin to see things getting under control, even though the economy is devastated. That remains because nobody's able to work. That's not true. People are able to work from home, but there are group settings like factories and especially restaurants and things like that cannot, and so there's a huge economic impact, and the people in Congress are trying to take care of that. They're trying to provide a fourth stimulus bill. There's been 3 so far that would be, from the most far out theories, which is Bernie Sanders articulating that everybody just needs to have their salary, their normal salary, even though they're unemployed. The government has to step in because otherwise the economy starts to spiral downward, and that's even more expensive, he says. But on the other hand, you have just the idea that at least the $1,200 checks will continue, that there will be amelioration in terms of what the government can do, including they're keeping all the airline people employed. They're not employed currently because the planes aren't flying, but they're keeping them taken care of. And that's part of the $500 billion stimulus that has been voted. That was the 3rd stimulus bill. $500 billion to the corporations to keep people on the payroll rather than letting them go without a paycheck, making it harder and harder for the economy to get through this. So I do think it is a turning point, which I think is good news. Of course, it's a turning point that depends on individual action. It depends on everybody stepping up to the plate, everybody recognizing their individual responsibility in this and that. It's so interesting to me that Eris is in square to the Pluto in all these configurations, including now, and including the one at the very beginning of the year, which was kind of the hallmark, the harbinger of the whole situation that wasn't really recognized by everybody at that time. And then this November 15th, resurgence, I believe, of the coronavirus, which is going to be difficult. That's going to be a time of great social unrest and kind of a resettlement of where we are as a society, and see if we can jumpstart ourselves into a new society, a new way of being that will honor human connection, that will honor care and concern for every individual person. And some of the values of, for example, the Native American peoples who said, you have to take care of everybody. You have to also listen to the grandmothers. The Council of the Grandmothers is important. And we need to heed some of those principles now today, I believe. So what else do we have? We have a strong position of Chiron as well. Chiron at 6 degrees of Aries is quite close in its sextile to both Mars, and it's semi-sextile to the next sign, where Uranus resides, which is representing also insights, also a change in thing. The Earth is changing, the situation with our bodies is changing, with Taurus representing the body. So we have a pretty strong occurrence of this entrance of Uranus into Taurus, supported by these the new moon, for example, right at 4 degrees of Aries, made a perfect angle, and the next new moon at the 22nd of April, which is Earth Day, is going to be right with, it's going to be at 4 degrees, I believe, with Uranus at 6. So it's going to be right there with Uranus. Very interesting stuff, because that will also involve these new planets, which I've been thinking about a lot, and they will be involved in this new moon on April 22nd, which is Earth Day. So I think that's fascinating too. Let's take a look at the U.S. chart while we're at it. We don't want to spend too much time on all of this, just maybe a short one today, a short discussion. And here we have the transit set up for the full moon. Interesting to note that this full moon is on the midpoint, not an exact midpoint, of course, but near the middle of Aries and Libra, and that's where this is the Saturn. I don't know if you can see it under all the aspect lines, but this is where Saturn resides in the U.S. chart. at 14 degrees of Libra, so at 48 minutes. So it's quite interesting. That's 4 degrees away, but the full moon axis does kind of light up the executive branch, meaning I believe that there will be something of a turning point there as well. Finally, I think the information is sinking in that what needs to happen, and we have to have the experts in charge. We have to have a national stay-at-home policy instead of leaving it up to the individual states. I think that's going to be happening. We also have, quite interestingly, the 24-degree mark of Pluto, as I've discussed before, being very illuminated at this time, right opposite Mercury, which represents the media in the United States. And the media is part of this whole situation in a very commanding way. It's almost like a fourth power in the country besides the executive and the congressional and the legislative and the judicial power, because that's giving information, that's getting information out. And as you know, there's a bit of a tussle going on between some of the media and the administration right now. They're criticizing the administration and saying this could have been done a little bit more coordinated. Let's get it together. And then also, interestingly, the 3-degree Cancer Venus, which is the ruler of the midheaven, which is again connected to the executive or to the way things are run from the top, is also being transited by this grand trine position. You have one sign over, you have the Venus transiting in the sky, and these are in trine with each other. The midpoint of Saturn and Mars is also 3, which is 3 degrees of Aquarius, which is an inconjunct to this point. And of course we do have the transiting position of, as I was referring to before, Maki right at the top of the U.S. chart, making an angle to the chart, the midheaven ruler, making them even more precise. It's a square angle, making an even more precise square to to Jupiter, which is the chart ruler, which rules the Sagittarius chart. So, and this is the best chart of the United States. I've determined. I think a lot of people have determined that. So it's very interesting to see this Maki as we approach Earth Day, right here at the 5-degree mark of Libra, right at the top of the chart, and squaring the ascendant ruler. In other words, we have a very strong environmental, actively environmental-oriented time right now. I started to mention Greta Thunberg. The reason I bring her up is because she does have a very strong Eris in a grand trine with Pluto and with Jupiter, and that Eris lies in a partile inconjunct to Maki in her chart, bringing the whole thing together. Eris also squares the Sun, and if she's born early in the morning, which is my bet, I bet she's born early in the morning when we get her time eventually, that also, Eris would square her natal moon as well, which is in Capricorn, along with the Sun. And a new moon configuration, so she strikes out on her own. A lot of Eris, so she's very much a paradigm shifter, a strong stand for herself, a feminine warrior, a spiritual warrior who's going to not take any bullshit and just going to go for it and say what she has to say and make a noise, make it happen. So I think that's very interesting to see that Maki is involved in that configuration. So we have a lot of environmental activism in this configuration, in this chart for the U.S. And jumping back to the full moon chart, you can see that there's a grand trine involving Maki. The fact that, incidentally, Chiron is opposite Maki is another strong indication that the Chiron, which indicates generally finding where the inner wound is and maybe doing something about it, recognizing that inner wounding, working with it, is very up for everybody right now, which is because, it reflects the situation that we're in, where everybody is kind of trying to figure out what's up, trying to handle it, trying to make the situation work for them somehow. And tuning into what's going on, tuning into where they may have been wounded in the past and may still have dysfunctional behavior on that basis, and maybe doing some meditating around that. It's a very good time for that, very good time to look inside, in our social isolation, to come up with who we are and what's up for ourselves, what's up for each one of us, and how we can do a little bit better with what's going on inside the psyche as we interact with others. So all of that's up for us right now, and the fact that it's so tied to these new planets is quite striking to me. The current trine between Mars and Venus persists because Venus is starting to slow down. It's going to be retrograde in May. It's going to stay in Gemini all this time for 4 months. So it retrogrades at, I think, about 12 degrees. And the date is, I believe, May 10th, if I've got that right. No, actually it's 21. It retrogrades at the 21 degree mark of Gemini and goes back to 5. So it stays in Gemini all this time over the summer. And it's a very powerful time when the idea of mentally getting it together as well as emotionally getting it together and in relationship is very much part of the whole summer that we've got coming up. So, in fact, in the 22nd of April, that new moon that's coming a couple of weeks from now, Venus moves to the 16 degree mark. Mars does too, and 16 degrees happens to be the midpoint of the Haumea and the Maki in this configuration, and then also 2 weeks from then, 2 weeks from now. So we have on Earth Day, we have these brand new planets that represent Earth issues, the midpoint of them in a grand trine with Mars and Venus. And I think that's just fascinating for really having an Earth Day that may mean something, that may mean greater recognition of what's going on with the environment. Because, it's a funny thing, this coronavirus response brings in the invisible enemy that only science can detect, that only science can see what the solutions might be. And that's exactly the same as climate change. And I think everybody's beginning to recognize that we have to pay attention to science, what it tells us. It tells us that we only have a certain amount of time to act to keep the carbon from getting overwhelming presence in the atmosphere, to make the greenhouse gas situation and global warming, therefore, a much more serious problem. And so everybody's been talking about that. I think you could also say maybe nobody's been doing much about it, at least not at the top levels of government. There's a lot of actions going on, a lot of organizations dedicated to it. But maybe we're beginning to see a more wider recognition, because when that happens, when everybody understands and knows what has to happen, the politicians will have no choice. That will be what they will do, because that will be what everybody expects. And that will be what's recognized as necessary. So I think we might have I think we might be beginning to get a handle on that worldwide recognition, and say in this country, the entire country recognizing that global warming's happening, that climate change is a reality, that we need to do stuff about it, just like we need to do stuff about handling this new virus, this pandemic, and getting it under control and getting ourselves back together as a community, as a social entity. So I think these are very interesting times, very challenging. You can certainly also find some solace in the fact that if we do a lot of introspection, if we help each other, if we communicate through media as we can right now, we can really turn something around in the society at this same timing. So at this point, I'd like to ask if there's any questions. I've got our producer, Leslie Benson, is on the line with me. So what do you think? We can ask, yes, if anybody that's watching, and we will be rebroadcasting this. If I'm talking to the people that have missed it, I can't really talk to them directly, but you will be able to see. We're going to have it up on your YouTube channel rather soon. So yes, any questions that come in, I'll try to answer them, and then I will transition back. I think that's the view that we started with. I think that it is such an important time, as I was saying, and I really do think that there's cause for hope, and we have a lot of chance to turn things around. There's a way you can look at things from a spiritual perspective and see the value of this time, that it makes people more conscious of what is the real important things. When the economic activity slows down to such an extent worldwide, we're seeing the sky's clear. Over Wuhan, they say that they never saw such a blue sky in Wuhan, China. And they say that the rivers are clearing up as well. So it's an interesting time to see the impacts of our culture and to see the necessary separation of each other from each other in a very present way, in a touching. We can't hug very well, but we can still connect through the internet. And that is a great thing. And we have a chance to really get together. We have a chance to really make a difference. Each one's individual behavior counts so much. And that's the message for right now. So best of luck with everything, and we will be talking soon. Take care.